Carnage in Gaza as Israel breaks the ceasefire, launching a wave of airstrikes, killing more than 300 Palestinians. Meanwhile, markets in Asia continue to climb, with tech stocks leading gains. And we look at how global trade could be impacted by escalating tariff wars. Hello, I'm Taiba Aydin with the latest business and finance news here on TRT World. We begin in Gaza, where more than 300 Palestinians, including women and children, have been killed in a series of Israeli airstrikes. Another 1,000 people have been wounded as the ceasefire in the enclave appears to have come to an end. The humanitarian situation continues to worsen as Israel has also continuing to block aid, causing prices for key resources to soar. This has pushed some Gazans to seek alternative ways of producing and supplying fuel, as Emre Boz reports.
Plumes of smoke rise as Gazans throw rubbish into an incinerator. But it's not just any old rubbish, it's plastic. Once melted, it's turned into fuel. The supply of this type of fuel provides essential support as Israel continues its blockade on essential items into Gaza.
We extract fuel from refined plastic materials that contain petroleum. We derive gasoline and diesel from this plastic, though it is not 100% pure. However, it is suitable for cars. We manage with it as we live under occupation and siege.
But the process is neither easy nor safe. Toxic fumes are inhaled, and the workers have hardly any safety gear. But for those left with very little, it's one way of making a living.
At first, I used to sell 200 to 300 liters, and there was a strong demand. But today, standing all day under the sun, I barely sell 50 liters to support myself.
The humanitarian situation in Gaza is getting worse every day. 90% of the population is displaced, and most lack access to shelter or any source of income. Since Israel began its war on Gaza, 92% of housing units have been destroyed, and about 70% of all structures have been damaged. Analysts say that reconstruction and recovery needs in Gaza will require around $53 billion over the next decade. But now, with Israel's latest strikes and its decision to end the ceasefire, that number is likely to rise. Emre Boz, TRT World.
Let's bring in Arwa Damon in Istanbul. She's the president and founder of NGO Inara. Now, Arwa, you've been on the ground in Gaza. Give us a sense of the humanitarian situation there.
Good morning. Actually, I was supposed to be in Gaza right now, but after having done 4 trips over the last year, being cleared by the Israelis on those occasions, I have now joined a growing number of humanitarian and medical workers who are being denied entry to Gaza. So what we have right now is a situation where everything is just being crippled to levels that are really beyond catastrophic. You have no humanitarian aid that has entered for more than 2 weeks. You have these growing numbers of humanitarian workers, much needed doctors, medical teams who are increasingly being denied access for no clear reason whatsoever. You have completely unaffordable prices for anything from, food to other basic necessities. You have a severe water shortage. You don't have enough medicines or other essential items, because we need to also remember that even when the ceasefire was still holding, even when humanitarian convoys, trucks were actually getting into Gaza, they were still lacking in access when it came to things like medicine and essential equipments for the hospital, or even fuel. And so we used to say, when I was last in Gaza in December, that Gaza was on life support, that the humanitarian capacity within Gaza was on life support. You look at the situation right now, well, it's a machine that's beeping and it's about to flatline.
And with the latest strikes, how much do you expect the condition to worsen, particularly given that blockade on food and medical aid, as you mentioned?
It's horrific, and it's impossible to sort of try to really encapsulate it. I was messaging with our team members this morning and other people who I know in Gaza, and those who have children say that, their kids woke up absolutely terrified, asking their parents, what's happening? How long is this going to last? Have we gone back to war? And parents don't know how to answer this. We need to remember that the vast majority of people in Gaza right now are hungry. I mean, look at those images on your screen right now. Look at those faces of the children and the desperation that is just etched across them. People are hungry. People are thirsty. People are getting injured in these bombings, going to hospitals that are barely functioning and that don't have enough supplies to properly be able to treat them, that don't have the staff to be able to handle this level of an influx of casualties. The situation is, again, I mean, we keep saying it over and over, beyond catastrophic, but we lack the vocabulary to really describe just how dire it is right now. And without the humanitarian aid being able to get in, without humanitarian workers having a certain level of access, and with these bombs falling right now, I mean, it's absolutely devastating.
Right, and it's still too soon to be discussing recovery efforts, but if and when this onslaught comes to an end, what is the estimated cost of rebuilding Gaza?
It's in the tens of billions of dollars, but actually, if you look back on the meeting of the Arab League countries that happened a few weeks ago, they had actually put forward a very comprehensive plan to bring about an end to all of this, a permanent solution, address all of Israel's concerns, and also put forward a plan to be able to begin rebuilding Gaza without displacing the Gazan population. This is something that would have to happen in stages. Rubble needs to be cleared. You need temporary container housing to be allowed into the Gaza Strip. There were actually tens of thousands of units of container homes that were supposed to be allowed into Gaza under the first phase of the ceasefire. That never actually materialized. You need to rebuild every single aspect of Gaza's infrastructure, from water piping to sewage piping to anything that you could possibly imagine. But Arab countries had basically put together this pledge to eventually take on much of the financial burden of responsibility for that. Unfortunately, right now, the situation that we see is one that is not, in the very least, conducive to even remotely begin thinking about that sort of an effort. It does not really seem at this stage that Israel has, and the U.S. for that matter, have any sort of intention to allow Gazans even the opportunity to be able to breathe. Again, I was speaking to a colleague of mine who's Palestinian from Gaza. She's in Gaza right now, and she was comparing what's happening to them as essentially similar to the waterboarding of an entire population. It's that level of psychological torture. And it's almost as if Gazans are collectively being, waterboarded, and then at the point when they think that they're about to die, being allowed to come up for one small little breath of air before being shoved underneath again. And now I'm getting messages asking me, how long is this going to last? What do I think is going to happen next? And I have absolutely no idea how to answer any of that.
Right, we will have to leave it there. Unfortunately, Arwa Damon from Inara, thank you very much for joining us. Now, Asia-Pacific markets rose on Tuesday, tracking gains on Wall Street, which ticked up after US retail sales data appeared to ease recession concerns. Hong Kong shares rose to 3-year highs and led Asian markets higher on Tuesday. The Hang Seng is up more than 2% in intraday trading and 23% year-to-date. Japan's benchmark Nikkei 225 rallied 1.43%, while the broader topics index rose 1.41% ahead of the Bank of Japan's two-day monetary policy meeting. Over in South Korea, the Kospi index advanced 0.17%, while the small-cap Kosdaq added 0.11% in choppy trade. Meanwhile, gold prices climbed to a record peak above the $3,000 mark on Tuesday as safe haven demand strengthened ahead of the US Federal Reserve's interest rate decision this week. For more on this, we're joined by Jamil Ahmed, Chief Analyst at GTC. Now, Jamil, the Hang Seng is leading gains in the region, rising to some 3-year highs. So what's behind this rally?
I would say it's definitely an outperforming market, and I think the catalyst behind this rally is that so far, if you consider how small Hong Kong is in terms of it being an economy that's not yet under the firing line of the Trump administration, those tantrums about different tariffs taking place in different parts of the world. Hong Kong hasn't yet been affected, but of course, there is an indirect impact here. Should we have a substantial slowdown in China or somewhere else in the region that is under the firing line of that Trump administration for tariffs, then that would have a knock-on effect. I think you also have to take into account that investors might just be looking to reallocate assets somewhere else and some portfolio diversification. Of course, the US markets have now had somewhat of a, let's say maybe a short-term correction, because previously all times the markets have gone down, investors have bought on discounts. But you do have concerns in the US right now where you've got major institutions that have upped the forecasts quite drastically for the potential or probability of a US recession this year. The likes of Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Research, PIMCO all see somewhere between a 35 to a 50% chance of a recession by the end of 2025. If we would have rewound and had those same forecasts just at the beginning of 2025, you only had like a 10 to 15% probability. So it's clear trade tensions and this trade war fears are definitely having a drag on economic sentiment. And I think some of these market moves are just purely that, short-term market moves.
Right, and looking at gold prices now, it's peaked above that $3,000 mark for a second time in a week. How much further do you see safe haven assets rising, and how is it affecting the broader market?
I think the question to ask is how long is these trade tensions and these trade threats going to continue for? And what is going to be the impact on the world economy? Because that very much holds the keys there for opening the door for how high gold could potentially be staring at us from above. If we take into account what the trade tensions meant last time, when you just had US-Sino trade tensions, that's US-China, that tit-for-tat episode we had between 2016 and 2017, 2018, we had the weakest year of global economic growth since the beginning of that decade. Fast forward to 2025, and the US has been the aggressor, and it's battling against many different fronts. It's not just China that's under the firing line. You've got the European Union, Mexico, Canada, steel and aluminium tariffs have been put on everybody. So that means the US is spread very thin. And if we do have a global economic downturn and the probability is getting higher by the week, then gold prices are still going to be a very interesting hedge for investors during what is likely to be ongoing uncertainty.
Right, Jamil Ahmed, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for being with us. Now, a quick look at some of the other top business stories from around the world. Shares in Chinese EV giant BYD surged more than 6% after unveiling a new charging system. The Super E platform claims to charge EVs in 5 minutes, matching gas refueling times. The company will also build 4,000 fast charging stations across China. Meanwhile, Baidu shares jumped nearly 10% on Tuesday after the Chinese tech giant released its latest AI model, rivaling DeepSeek. The news lifted tech stocks, pushing Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index up 2%. The tech giant says its new model improves reasoning and problem solving, strengthening its position in China's competitive AI race. Canada has removed Tesla from its EV incentive program for taxis and ride shares amid trade tensions with the US. The ban will stay until trade issues with the White House are resolved. Officials link the move to Tesla CEO Elon Musk's ties with President Trump, who imposed hefty tariffs on Canadian goods. And Audi is cutting 7,500 jobs in Germany as it faces slowing EV demand and rising Chinese competition. The cuts, which make around 8% of its global workforce, aim to boost efficiency and reduce costs. The automaker also plans to invest around $9 billion in its German factories to support EV production and AI development. Still ahead on the programme, global trade hit a record $33 trillion in 2024, reshaping power, economies and futures. Who wins, who loses? We find out after this short break. Welcome back. Global trade hit a record high of $33 trillion in 2024, though there was a drop in momentum in the fourth quarter. According to a recent report by the UN Trade and Development, the services sector grew 9% for the year, adding $700 billion. That accounts for nearly 60% of total trade growth. Meanwhile, trade in goods saw a modest 2% increase, contributing $500 billion. Developing economies surpassed developed nations in trade activity. Their imports and exports rose by 4% over the year, with a 2% increase in the fourth quarter. The growth was mainly driven by East and South Asia. In contrast, developed economies saw trade stagnate throughout the year and decline 2% in the final 3 months of 2024. China and India outperformed the global average, while Russia, South Africa and Brazil trading remained sluggish for most of the year. Looking ahead, global trade faces growing uncertainty. A full-scale trade war driven by US President Donald Trump's tariffs could deliver a serious blow to global trade. Mounting geopolitical tensions and fears of an economic slowdown add to the risks. Meanwhile, declining demand for container shipping signals weaker trade volumes in the months ahead. For more, let's bring in Mario Ruiz, Professor of International Economics at the University of Kuala Lumpur. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, the US and its biggest trading partners are now locked in a bitter trade dispute. When do you think businesses and customers will start to notice a difference in costs, and how much of an impact will it have?
Okay, well, my prediction is between 3 or 5 months from now, is going to see deeply the impact of this tariff. You need to remember that tariff is high important, and who is going to affect is the final consumer. This is the problem. Actually, the firms never going to be affected because they're going to bring the product to the customers. But the problem is the final price of the tariff is paid by the consumer, and the consumers, if have high price, the consumption is going to reduce logically and going to have high impact in the economic growth of the countries. Remember, I mentioned many times, we're going to suffer a global inflation. And this global inflation is going to hit directly on the economic growth worldwide, going to generate an economic recession in September, October, and December, or January 2026, maybe we're going to have economic depression. Economic depression is horrible because we have stagflation, we have inflation plus unemployment, because if the people stop to buying products, the stocks is going to increase several times, and it's going to generate over stocks. What happened in 1929, the Great Depression in the United States? We are making the same mistakes like 100 years ago, the same mistakes. And what's the trick, the end, was the Second World War to come out to reorganize the world economy, and the United States become the supremacy or leader of the economy worldwide. But now it's different because the context of the international trade is changing dramatically. It's very hard for the United States to accept that China is coming up economic and militarily, and it's going to have high impact. They want to fix the economy. Now it's quite late, actually. But I think we need to rectify the new order is coming, and establishing slowly. And remember that the United States is a country that depends on openness, open trade. But if they start to use closeness, international trade, it's going to affect several times the final consumer of the United States. Remember that the economy of the United States depends on the consumption. If the consumption drops, all the American economy shaking and drop. The stock market, SP 500, for example, is depending highly on the consumption of commodities in services. Then you need to see, it's going to be a very complex situation for the United States because they cannot control the inflation until now. It's not only this. The job market in the United States, the unemployment is growing. And it's not so easy to fix the American economy in this time because new leaders in international trade come out. We have, for example, we have China, we have India, and we have several new countries who come out in the international trade. tariff is not going to generate, I explained too many times to people, tariff is equal to inflation. It's normally, and who's going to pay this high inflation is going to the final consumer. And this is what people cannot see clearly, that who is affecting is not the governments or the private sector or firms. It's going to affect directly on the final consumer.
Right, and President... Sorry, you can...
Yeah, please.
Right, President Trump hopes these tariffs will be a boost to US industry and manufacturing. Do you think that will be the case?
No, it's not like that. It's more complex. The situation is more complex. Look, if you are not competitive, and you take it with tariff, you're going to generate white elephants. It's useless. To protect something, the productivity is low. And the performance is going to be low, and it's going to make more expensive goods and services for the country. Look, free trade and open economy, what is generating is competition. And competition is basically improvement. The consumer have different prices. They can buy better products in low price. But how are you going to pay so high price for some commodities or services that they are not competitive in the market? And this one is what we need to rectify. Americans need to see that the new context of the world economy changed fully complete. It's not like before. Now, people thinking that China is a simple country that 50 or 100 years ago was in extreme poverty, but China changed technologically, economically, socially. Maybe people are going to tell me politically is continuing communist. It's not communist. China changed, make a new kind of system. And I don't want to talk about ideologies, but we need to rectify that the mechanism, how they are using, is very successful. More than the free trade or democracy that Americans they say.
Right, and which industries are most vulnerable to the escalating trade tensions?
Look, it's very hard. We need to divide the economy in 4 sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, heavy industry, and also we need to see services. I just finished research. The agriculture sector in the United States, I protect it because they protect the agriculture sector. Manufacturing is lower, if you see in this context, that they prefer to buy cheap manufacturing from China. But the problem is the massive consumption of the United States in manufacturing. And the heavy industry, now they impose tariff to Canada and in all these industrial countries to revive the local domestic industry. Services, I think the United States continue in good shape, continue good performance. But remember that the economy is not surviving with services. The economy survives with goods and services, goods production. Now, you tell me what sectors. I think all these sectors, they are vulnerable for the United States.
All right,
but
Professor
I feel that
Mario Ruiz, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
Now, the Trump administration has sparked controversy with massive layoffs at Voice of America and other US-funded media outlets. Is this a strategic move to silence critical voices or a calculated effort to reshape global media influence? Nicholas Morgan has the details.
This is a voice speaking from America.
That iconic sound marked a legacy. For decades, Voice of America reached 49 countries and is seen by many as a beacon of free press. But with a single email, the staff at the US Agency for Global Media, which oversees VOA, learned they were out of jobs. It said contractors must cease all work immediately and were not permitted to access any agency buildings or systems. The White House has defended the decision, branding VOA as radical propaganda. Trump has long criticized VOA's coverage, especially of his administration. Some argue he's waging a war on media he doesn't agree with.
Family, you have children, and the New York Times will write whatever these people say, and the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, and MSDNC, and the fake news CNN, and ABC, and CBS, and NBC, and they'll write whatever they say. And what do you do to get rid of it? You convict Trump. All you have to do is be really tough on him and ultimately convict him, and they leave you alone. It's totally illegal what they do.
Only at the end of last month, Carrie Lake, the former news anchor and a Trump ally, was nominated to lead the US Agency for Global Media. On Saturday, she wrote on their website,
"Waste, fraud, and abuse run rampant in this agency, and American taxpayers shouldn't have to fund it."
Over 3,000 jobs are on the line. They're not just American employees. Some rely on their VOA jobs for work visas. And it didn't stop there. The US Agency for Global Media extends beyond America's borders. Outlets like Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia felt the freeze too. The Global Times, China's mouthpiece, recently wrote,
"The monopoly of information held by traditional Western media is being shattered."
While the US is scaling back on soft power through the US Agency for Global Media, the likes of China and Russia are significantly increasing their state-sponsored media presence across the globe. The timing of these cuts raises serious questions about the future of American influence in global journalism. Nicholas Morgan, TRT World.
Well, that's all your business news for now. Thanks for watching.